Picture this. You're standing in a muddy field. Rain is hammering down. Your heart is pounding so hard you can feel it in your teeth. And in your hand, you're holding a severed human head. But here's the thing. That head, it's not a trophy. It's a transaction. That one head is your family's ticket out of poverty, out of nothing. Straight into a house, a plot of land, a government stipend, and full tax exemption for life. That's not a metaphor. That was literally the law. 2,000 years ago, the Qin Empire, the dynasty that unified all of China, ran the most ruthless, most effective performance management system in human history. And today, we're going to take it apart piece by piece. Because the organizational mechanics underneath, they will change how you think about execution, incentive design, and why certain teams fight like their lives depend on it while others can barely show up on time. Let's set the scene. It's roughly 350 BC. You're a peasant farmer in the Qin Kingdom, one of 7 rival states locked in a centuries-long war for control of China. You have no last name. You have no political rights. You're one bad harvest away from starvation. Then a man named Sheng Yang walks into the palace and rewrites the entire operating system of your world. Before Sheng Yang, warfare in ancient China worked a lot like the medieval jousting tournaments you've seen in movies. It was a gentleman's game. The nobility led the charge, and common soldiers shuffled along behind them, motivated by nothing except the vague fear of death. If you survived, great. If the battle went badly, you melted into the countryside. Nobody was keeping score on you specifically. Sheng Yang ended all of that. He introduced something that, in modern terms, looks less like a military reform and more like a startup's OKR system fused with a video game's ranked ladder. Every soldier, every citizen was now assigned a performance rank. Your rank determined everything: your house size, your land allocation, your tax rate, your servants, your family's legal status. And the only way to move up? Enemy heads. Not vague contributions to the war effort. Not seniority. Not your father's rank. Enemy heads, confirmed kills, verifiable output. One officer level head got you to level 1, what they called Gongxi. Keep climbing, rack up more heads. Level 20. Chehao was the peak. Massive estates, massive influence, massive wealth. Now here's the part that hits different. This wasn't just a military system. This was the social contract for the entire nation. Sheng Yang applied the same logic to farming, construction, civil administration, every domain of Qin life. Let's pause right there, because I want you to think about what just happened. Here's the question I want you to sit with for a second. Imagine you're a soldier. You're standing at the edge of a battlefield. The horns are about to blow. You really know that if you don't perform today, if you come back without at least one confirmed kill, the government will seize your family's home. Your daughter will be assigned to a state labor factory, and there's no negotiation, no appeal, no, we'll look the other way this time. In that moment, do you feel fear, or do you feel something else entirely? Something closer to a wolf who hasn't eaten in 3 days and just spotted meat. That is what Sheng Yang was engineering. Not courage, not patriotism. A neurological state, a survival mode execution drive baked directly into the incentive architecture. Let's go deeper into the mechanics. The system Sheng Yang designed was called the 20-grade nobility system, and calling it a nobility system actually undersells how radical it was. Because the whole point was to destroy traditional nobility. Think of it like this. Imagine if Amazon, the NFL, and Call of Duty's ranked matchmaking had a baby. That's roughly the vibe. Before Sheng Yang, Chinese society operated on inherited status. You were born into an aristocratic family. You kept your titles forever. Birth was destiny. The battlefield was basically a place for nobles to collect glory and for everyone else to die anonymously. Sheng Yang looked at that system and said, "We're burning it down." Under his reforms, hereditary privilege was not just reduced, it was legally abolished. If you were the cousin of the king and you failed to perform on the battlefield, your noble title was stripped. Publicly, by law, you became a commoner. Conversely, if you were a nobody, a landless serf, a former prisoner, Someone with nothing and you produce results, you climb the ladder. Fast. The ranks unlocked real, tangible rewards at every level. Not promises, not culture, actual square footage, actual tax exemptions, actual legal protections. Every rung of the ladder was precisely defined: how many acres of farmland, how many servants you were permitted, what kind of house you could build. This is what behavioral economists now call transparent incentive architecture. There was zero ambiguity about what success meant and what it earned you. Let me make this concrete with a modern analogy. Imagine a Fortune 500 company that publicly announces your bonus, your equity vesting, your job security, even your parking spot. All of it is determined by one metric, one public scoreboard. No politics, no nepotism, no, well, he's been here 15 years, pure output. Now imagine that metric is locked in law, not HR policy law, and the CEO's own son is subject to the exact same scorecard. That's what Qin did. And here's what happened. The people who had been written off their entire lives, the farmers, the laborers, the guys at the very bottom of the old feudal order, went absolutely feral for this system. Because for the first time, the game was winnable. A fixed, rigged system produces despair. A hard system with clear rules produces obsession. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but what about the people who just didn't want to play? What about the Qin citizen who wanted to stay home, grow his vegetables, maybe run a small business on the side? Great question. Xiangyang had an answer for that too, and it was not gentle. He implemented a set of economic policies that historians call the 5 tools of weakening the people. The goal was simple: make every possible path to stability except farming and fighting either illegal or economically catastrophic. Entertainment, banned. Music, performance, poetry, philosophy, all of it was classified as productivity-destroying distraction. Think of it as Xiangyang's version of blocking social media on company devices, except instead of a content filter, the punishment was enslavement. Private commerce, taxed into extinction. Merchants were subject to punitive tax rates so severe that running a business meant guaranteed financial ruin. The state monopolized grain trading entirely. If you wanted to eat, you worked for the system. The logic was explicit. A well-fed, comfortably entertained population has options. Options breed complacency. And complacency in a state permanently at war is an existential threat. Does this remind you of anything? Think about certain high-growth startup cultures. The ones that recruit aggressively from recent graduates, offer free meals, laundry, gym, everything on campus while quietly structuring compensation so heavily in unvested equity that leaving means financial suicide. The golden handcuffs aren't a perk, they're architecture. They're the hamster wheel dressed up as a luxury apartment. Xiangyang just did it with a lot less branding. Here's where the story gets genuinely weird. You'd expect the ordinary people of Qin to hate this system, to despise Xiangyang, to resent every minute of living inside this machine. They didn't. When Xiangyang was eventually executed, killed by the very aristocrats whose power he dismantled, the common people mourned him. Historical records describe widespread grief in the streets. Why? Because the system, brutal as it was, had one quality that the old order never had. It was fair. In the rival kingdoms, think of them as the other teams in the conference. The old aristocracy could commit crimes and buy their way out. The rich could rig the courts. The poor had no recourse, no ladder, no path. The injustice wasn't just economic, it was structural and permanent. In Qin, the king's own son was publicly stripped of rank when he broke the law. The rulebook applied to everyone. And this is a profound psychological truth. People will tolerate an extremely hard game if they believe the game is honest. What humans cannot psychologically endure is not difficulty, it's arbitrary unfairness. A grueling but transparent meritocracy will generate more genuine buy-in than a comfortable but politically rigged environment every single time. Okay, so you have a nation of people who are extremely motivated, playing by transparent rules, competing ferociously for clearly defined rewards. But motivation alone doesn't win wars. or scale companies. You also need infrastructure. And this is where Qin's second superpower comes into focus. While the other 6 kingdoms were still running logistics the old-fashioned way, improvised supply chains, aristocratic officers making up the rules as they went, chronic corruption in the grain distribution networks, Qin was running something that, at the time, was almost incomprehensibly sophisticated. Picture Amazon's fulfillment network, not the customer-facing part, the back end, the inventory management, the route optimization, the real-time accountability at every node in the chain. Qin did this with bamboo tablets and abacuses. The legal code that Shang Yang and his successors built wasn't just about crime and punishment. It was a total operating manual for the state. Every logistical obligation was codified into law. How much grain a prefecture must stockpile before winter? Exactly how many oxen and carts are required to transport X tons of wheat across Y miles to the front lines? The precise caloric accounting for what soldiers consume on a 500-mile march versus a 200-mile march. The allowable spoilage rate. The mandatory audit schedule. Every local official, essentially a middle manager, was personally, legally liable for hitting these numbers. Not in a vague, "we'll have a performance review" sense. In a "you will be publicly punished if this shipment is late" sense. Here's a real comparison that lands hard. Imagine, it's 230 BC, and 2 armies are fighting for control of eastern China. In the rival kingdom's army, the supply chain is a mess. Aristocratic administrators are skimming grain for profit. The paperwork is incomplete. The general at the front is waiting on a resupply that's 3 weeks late because 2 nobles at court are in a political dispute about who controls the transport routes. Meanwhile, a Qin supply officer, a guy with no noble title, just a government-appointed logistics manager, is moving 200,000 pounds of grain and tens of thousands of precisely manufactured bronze arrowheads across 500 miles of difficult terrain. On schedule, below budget, with documented chain of custody the entire way. The arrowheads, by the way, are standardized to a tolerance that would impress a modern machinist. Interchangeable parts, mass-produced. Everyone stamped with the name of the workshop that made it and the inspector who cleared it, so there's a paper trail if anything fails. That's not just military superiority. That's systems thinking versus improvisation. And systems thinking wins. Every time. For 150 years, this engine ran flawlessly. It chewed through every rival kingdom. One by one, Qin absorbed their territory, redistributed their land as performance bonuses, and converted their populations into new fuel for the machine. By 221 BC, the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, stood atop a unified empire, the only man who had ever conquered all of China. And then something deeply strange happened. The machine kept running. It didn't know how to stop. Here's the design flaw that Shang Yang, one of history's greatest systems architects, apparently never solved. He built the machine for expansion, and he never built an exit ramp. The entire psychological and economic engine of the Qin system was fueled by conquest. You go to war, you kill enemies, you take their land, you distribute that land as bonuses to your soldiers. Everyone gets paid, everyone stays motivated, everyone stays loyal. But when you've beaten everyone, when the entire known world is already inside your borders, there's no more land to distribute. There's no more enemy KPI to hit. The soldiers who've spent their entire lives on a performance ladder that only moved upward through external conquest now find the ladder has no more rungs. Let me ask every manager and founder watching this a direct question. Imagine you've built a team that is completely wired for competitive execution. Their bonuses, their equity, their career trajectory, their identity, all of it is indexed to defeating competitors in the market. Now, imagine you win. You actually win. Market share, 100%. No more competitors, no acquisition targets left. How do you pay those people? What's the quarterly goal? What does the leaderboard even measure now? The Qin Empire didn't have a good answer, and the consequences were catastrophic. Without an external enemy, the enforcement machine turned inward. The only way to demonstrate that the system was still working, still rigorous, still serious, was to apply its zero-tolerance logic to its own citizens. Laws became harsher. Minor infractions became capital offenses. The bureaucracy, which had been a remarkable tool for coordination, calcified into an instrument of oppression. And then came the moment that ended everything. In 209 BC, a labor crew was traveling to a construction site in the northeast. They hit rain. The roads were flooded. They were going to be late. Under Qin law, arriving late to your assigned post was a capital offense. The penalty was death. Two men, Chen Sheng and Wu Guang, looked at the calendar, looked at the rain, looked at each other, and made a calculation. If we're going to die either way, we'd rather die fighting. They started a rebellion. Within 3 years, the empire was gone. The very people who'd been the most enthusiastic participants in the Qin system, the farmers, the laborers, the soldiers from the bottom of the social ladder, tore the whole thing apart. Not because they rejected the idea of meritocracy, but because the machine had turned on them, and the original promise that the rules applied to everyone fairly had been abandoned. Let's step back and look at this whole arc. What Shang Yang built was genuinely extraordinary, and I want to be careful not to oversimplify it into a simple cautionary tale. The core mechanics of what he designed were advanced in ways that we're still rediscovering in organizational psychology and game theory. He created a closed incentive loop that eliminated passive participation. Nobody in Qin could coast. Nobody could hide behind a vague job description. Output was the only currency. He used radical transparency, published rules, public scorecards, no exceptions to build legitimacy with the very people who had every reason to resent the system. He built accountability infrastructure so deep into the legal code that even routine logistics became a matter of professional honor, not personal discretion. And he understood something that modern HR departments often miss. Rules that apply to everyone create buy-in, even when those rules are hard. People don't quit hard games, they quit unfair ones. But here's where it falls apart. Shang Yang made two critical design errors that are worth burning into your memory, because both of them appear constantly in modern organizations. Error 1. No exit strategy. He designed for infinite growth in a finite world. The entire reward architecture assumed there would always be new territory to conquer, always new resources to distribute. When that assumption broke, the system had no fallback. There was no "what do we do when we win" protocol. Every high-growth organization eventually hits this wall. The question isn't if you'll reach saturation, it's whether you've designed for what comes next. Error 2. He optimized humans out of their humanity. The suppression of art, philosophy, commerce, leisure, all of it made sense within his narrow logic. But it created a population that was highly effective and deeply brittle. When the external pressure released, there was no internal cohesion to replace it. Community, culture, meaning these aren't productivity drains. They're the shock absorbers that keep an organization functional when the environment turns hostile. A team that is only motivated by fear and reward has a half-life. At some point, the fear fades or the rewards stop coming. What replaces it? If the answer is nothing, you're one bad quarter away from collapse. So, what do we actually carry forward from this? Not the brutality. That's obvious. But the brutality was the implementation, not the principle. Strip that away, and here's what remains. 1. Alignment through incentive design, not culture decks. Shang Yang didn't give speeches about team values. He designed a system where individual self-interest and organizational goals were structurally identical. The most powerful alignment tool isn't inspiration, it's architecture. When doing the right thing for the team is also the optimal move for the individual, you've solved the coordination problem. 2. Radical clarity about what performance actually means. The soldiers knew exactly what was expected of them. Not bring your best effort, not contribute to the mission. One head, one rank, unambiguous. Modern organizations are often paralyzed by the opposite: vague goals, unclear ownership, metrics that measure activity instead of output. Precision is motivating, ambiguity is demoralizing. 3. Rules that apply to everyone, including the people at the top. This is the single most underrated driver of team loyalty. The moment employees perceive a double standard that leadership is exempt from the rules that bind everyone else, the legitimacy of the entire system collapses. Qin's common people respected a brutal system because it was consistent. They destroyed it when it became arbitrary. 4. Build the second growth curve before you need it. Qin's fatal flaw wasn't its performance culture. It was the absence of a pivot mechanism, a design pathway for what the organization becomes when the original mission is complete. Every startup, every team, every company needs to ask this question before it becomes urgent. When we win at the current game, what's the next game? The Qin Empire lasted 15 years after unification. The Han dynasty that replaced it lasted 400. The Han kept much of Qin's administrative machinery, the legal code, the logistic systems, the meritocratic examination structure. But they added something Qin never had, a philosophical foundation that wasn't purely transactional. They gave people a reason to belong that wasn't just fear and reward. They built a culture that could survive peace. That's the lesson. Not be less like Qin, but be more than Qin. The execution culture, the transparency, the incentive, precision, those are worth keeping. The failure to design for human complexity, the absence of meaning beyond performance, the inability to pivot when the external environment shifted, those are the things that brought the whole thing down. If you're building a team right now, whether that's 10 people or 10,000, the questions Shengyang never answered are the ones you need to be asking today. What happens when your team wins? What holds them together when the external pressure releases? And what does your organization stand for beyond the scoreboard? 2,000 years later, those questions still don't have easy answers. But at least now you know what happens when you skip them. If this kind of deep dive using history as a lens to examine modern organizational design is the kind of content that sharpens how you think, hit subscribe. We're doing this every week. Next episode, we're looking at another Qin innovation that predates modern industrial manufacturing by 2,000 years. A quality control system so precise that every single weapon produced in the empire had its maker's name stamped on it. Accountability baked into the supply chain at the component level. It's the kind of thing that would make a Six Sigma consultant's jaw drop. That's next time. See you then.